take my glasses off because I can see better close up. Bottom of the Mug by S.P.Dorning. Are you trying to rob me? Malden looked over the dwarven soldier with the eye of a con setting up his next mark. He considered himself a professional, even at 12 years old. That there is a bona fide relic of Arentia. You couldn't touch it for 3 coppers, much less buy it. That brought a round of laughs from the soldiers' drinking buddies. The dwarf scowled and started to hand the beaten brass lamp back to the boy. Everybody knows Orentia is just a myth, boy. I was just trying to do you and your uncle a solid by giving you a little business. But if'n you don't want the coppers. Now, Benny, we're friends. We've been doing business a long time. That's why I thought of you first. I know how you like history and all, and that lamp's got history. Surely it's worth 6 coppers to you. Bargain like that may never come your way again. I'll give you 3. Me and my uncle may starve if I don't get at least 5 out of it. I'll tell you what. I'll give you 4, just because of you taking care of that good-for-nothing uncle of yourn. You're a good kid, but he don't deserve you. I hope you know you're probably going to find our bones locked up in Pa's old shack before the week's out. Then you'll look back and say that 1 copper could have saved the poor boy if I could only go back in time. The soldiers laughed again, and Benny grinned at him. All right, boy, it was worth a copper just to see that act. Benny handed him 5 coppers. And don't be spending it on booze for that old sot you call an uncle, either. I'll keep my eyes peeled for any more historical artifacts that you might be wanting. Malden called over his shoulder as he ran back toward Valinor. You do that, boy, Benny called after him. You know that lamp is garbage, don't you, Ben? Alder looked at the lamp that Benny held loosely in his calloused hands. He probably picked it up off the garbage heap outside of town. As a matter of fact, I know he did, seeing as to how I throwed it out last week, Benny chuckled. And you just let him rip you off for 5 coppers? Alder was new to the group of grizzled soldiers that sat around on the front porch of the outpost office building. How you know it's the same lamp? Well, for one, I throwed it out because it's got a cracked oil tank, and for another, it's got my initials carved into the bottom. You're new, Alder, aren't you? You just don't understand about them humans. What's to know? Sounds like even the kids are crooks and thieves. That boy's had a rough life. His uncle was a Seekin pirate named Onagar. Onagar talked the boy's father into joining the crew. The ship was lost and the boy's father with it. Onagar was the only one of the few folks to come back. They still don't know what happened to Onagar's sister. The boy's mother took sick last year. She died too. Now the boy supports the both of them, while Onagar drowns his sorrows in the bottom of a mug. I buy the garbage he brings me because it helps keep them fed, and it keeps them from doing something stupid like joining up with them dockside gangs. Yeah, you've got a bit of a soft side, eh, Ben? Alder grinned. I'll tell you what, Alder. You just show up late for your shift tomorrow, and we'll see how much of a soft side I've got. Malden knew his uncle was going to be angry when he got back home. It wasn't his fault. He had tried to sell the lamp to 2 other people before offering it to the dwarven soldiers up the road. It was a good walk to the outpost, and whenever he made the trip out there, he always ended up coming home late. He knew his uncle was only angry because he was worried about Malden. But today was special. Today he was considered a man by all the laws and customs of the sea-kin. He dropped by the Water Baby Inn and dickered with old Miss Henley over a bottle of cooking sherry, finally agreeing on 2 coppers. It wasn't the good stuff, but his uncle had gotten used to it since they couldn't afford rum. It was probably just as well that they couldn't. His uncle couldn't handle rum well. It tended to turn him sullen and irritable. Leaving the inn, he turned into a back alley he used as a shortcut back to the Fens. The Fens was what the locals called the cheap side of the little town of Valinor. It was where all the riffraff and loners ended up. It had been a decent neighborhood when his pa had bought the little shack that Malden and his uncle now called home. The years had not been kind to Valinor, and communities like the Finns were beginning to be more commonplace around its edges. His uncle kept saying that the town was dead, it just didn't know it yet. Malden made another turn down the alley that ran behind the butcher's place, but had to take a detour when he came within sight of the little shop. The butcher had left Leadbelly, his guard dog, chained to the support post at the back door. Nobody messed with Leadbelly. Malden had seen the big dog eat a tin can one day. He had no desire to test his hide against the dog's sharp teeth. As a result, Malden reached their humble little shack just as the last rays of the sun were sinking over the horizon. "Where in blazes you been, boy?" Uncle Onegor met him at the curtain they had hung across the opening that used to hold the front door before it rotted through, finally falling apart last year. "I had to make a trip to the outpost, Unc." Malden brushed by him and went straight to the old stove they had set up in the corner. The oil-burning mechanism had long since corroded and didn't work anymore, so Malden had cut a hole in the top and laid a piece of iron across it. He vented the smoke out the back through a knothole in the clapboard siding. The stove doubled as a heater in winter. You know I don't like you messing around with them dwarves," Onager grumbled as he followed Malden in. "We needed the money, and nobody else was buying." Malden tossed the explanation over his shoulder as he lit the fire and laid out that morning. "You know what today is, Unc?" I think maybe it's... No, that can't be right. No," Onager answered as he took the sherry Malden held out to him. "Should I?" "Today is my birthday, Unc," Malden said quietly as he waited for the fire to heat the makeshift griddle up enough to cook on. "Today I am 12 years old. You know what that means, don't you, Unc?" "Now you wait just 1 minute." "It means I'm considered a man by all the customs of the Seekin." Malden didn't wait for his uncle to finish the statement, but plowed on ahead. "That means that you, as my guardian, owe me a boon before I set off in the world to make my way." You're going to leave?" Onager looked down at the sherry he held in his hand. A strange sound had colored those 3 words as they came out of his uncle's mouth, almost as if his uncle was scared. "I might. Haven't decided yet." Malden answered. "Either way, you still owe me the boon." "Heck, you knows I ain't got no money." "Not after money." "If not money, then what?" "The truth." Onager took one look at the stubborn set of the boy's jaw and knew what was coming. He pulled the stopper from the top of the bottle and took a long swallow of the harsh liquid, knowing he would need the courage before too much longer. "Truth about what?" He didn't like the way his voice sounded. It sounded weak and afraid. "The truth about my father. I want to know how he died. I want to know why you were the only one to make it back. I want to know everything about that voyage." "Nay, you don't want to know, lad." Onager turned away with a sad sigh. "But I can see you won't let that be your answer. So, come over here and bring that oil lamp. Let's burn what's left of the fish oil in it. We'll be glad for the light before my tale's over." "Your father wasn't the pirate type, boy. The only reason he took the job was y'all needed the coin. And I swear to you, boy, if I'd have known how it was going to keel over, I never would have talked Captain Gingish into hiring him. As a matter of record, that was one of the first talks I remember having with him on deck." Jim Brant sighed as he coiled the rigging line up and stowed it away. He hadn't wanted to sign on with the crew of the Wayward Lass. Everyone knew they were pirates. Most of the other races thought all humans were pirates, but that was like saying all gnomes were con artists. Just wasn't true. He had let Onager, his brother-in-law, talk him into it for two reasons. They were willing to loan him enough money against his wages to take care of his wife and little boy while he was gone, and they were the only ship hiring. It was only going to be a 6-month job, 8 at the most. Why so low, Jimmy boy? Onager clapped him on the back and offered him the wineskin he held in his other hand. I don't know if I can do this, Onager. Do what? Coal rigging? No, be a pirate. Shh, Onager hissed, pulling him over the rail away from any who might overhear. There's probably won't be nothing happening on this voyage, Jim. You just gotta keep that kind of talk to yourself. You know how hard it was for me to talk Captain Jinjash into hiring you on in the first place? I know, and I really appreciate it. I just keep thinking about all the things I might be expected to do. You just stop that kind of thinking right now. More than likely you won't be asked to do anything more than you already are. And if there is any action, it ain't likely to include the whole ship, which is where you're gonna be. You're probably right. I know I'll be right. You just be taking care of the sailing part, and we'll worry about the piratey things, if they happen. And it seemed like that was the way the whole voyage was going to go. Alas, fate had another plan. You see, there was something that us regular salt dogs didn't know. We probably would not even known it if not for your paw. Your paw drew the late watch one night, close to the end of the outbound leg of the trip. Jim knew there had been a noise. It sounded like people talking. He eased his way around the edge of the ship, pausing every once in a while to listen. It was just pure chance that he had heard it. The wind had died down suddenly, and the speaker had continued to talk loudly for a few seconds. Once he heard it, though, he didn't have any problem hearing it again. He knew what to listen for. He found himself standing at the skylight over the captain's cabin. A soft glow could be seen just through the grime-covered glass. The light itself seemed odd. It was green and flickering. He had never seen lamplight glimmer like that. More than the voices was what drew him closer to investigate. The wind had been howling before, but it died down to a breeze as he looked down through the skylight, as if it too wanted to hear what was being said. In the cabin below, Jim could see only one person. The captain sat at the chart table at the blaze that was staring at the blaze that was burning the wood. Jim caught himself before he sounded the alarm. The desk wasn't on fire. The fire was coming from a green jewel that lay there on it. He had never seen a jewel like that before, so he eased around to view it from a different angle. That was when he saw it. There was movement within the fire. The captain was talking to someone within the flame. So when I see them monsters getting ready to blow the horn, I'm supposed to activate the black box you gave me. Captain Jinjish rubbed the considerable stubble on his chin and eyed the being in the flame. Why would they? They don't usually go around attacking ships for no reason. We have sent in words through some of our agents that your slavers come to raid them. If you present yourself as such, they will attack. The voice was muffled by the glass, and the words were cut with a familiar-sounding accent. How you know they'll be using that horn artifacty thingy? What if they just fighting us tooth and claw? Our agents accidentally leaked that you would be using magical means that they would be unable to counter with mundane defenses. You mean naturally? Yes, naturally. The voice oozed with disdain. That accent was like a thorn in Jim's side. It sounded so familiar, he just couldn't quite place it. He shifted around so he was directly over the captain, but was still hidden in the darkness. And then what happens? The box that we gave you will absorb the horn's energies. Once the gem on the side glows blue, the process is complete. You close the lid and bring the box back to us. The voice was louder from this side. The captain was paying close attention to the flame, so Jim took the chance. Reaching out with his sleeve, he wiped some of the grime from the glass. Holding his breath, he looked back down into the room, expecting the captain to be standing alert, but all was as it had been. And then I get me money after I give you the box. That's correct. Jim's breath hissed as he drew it into his lungs in a quick gasp. He had known the accent. The speaker was an elf. Your pa told me the whole story. I didn't believe him. Talking fire and the captain dealing with elves and secrets and all. Who would have? But your pa had been telling the truth. None of us knew what we were coming to the Monster Isle for. We all thought it would be to pilfer some of their treasures. We weren't really rigged for a slaving run. No shackles, you see. You can't haul slaves without shackling them. Yet we made the run that day just like we was ready to go a-slaving. The captain didn't say why. But your pa was kind of prejudiced against elves. He once told me the story of how his brother was cut down by an elf. He believed that they was out to get the rest of the world. Said that they was all evil and he was watching the captain with a fine eye. Jim had even taken to going armed all the time. We still did not see no proof of elves. And even if the captain was dealing with them, what of it? It weren't like it was illegal or nothing. There was no reason for him to hide it. We ain't never heard of no magic horn either. And what would the elves be needing with it anyways? I still ain't sure till this day. But I believe your pa was right. I have to believe he was. 'Tis the only way I can stay sane. So we sailed up to those islands, whooping and carrying on like we was a-coming a-raiding. The captain even had us fire our cannon off. That's when we seen 'em. They was standing up on the cliffs, watching us. Your pa had spotted 'em already with his spotting scope, and they had the horn with 'em. A heavy wake followed the wayward lash as it sped toward the bay that was to be its anchor point. The whooping had died down once Jim had pointed the strange-looking creatures out. They stood on the low cliffs that overlooked the bay. With the naked eye, they looked human from a distance. They stood like men and held weapons like a man. But along with the normal two arms, they had spider-like legs sprouting from their rib cages, and their heads were all wrong. They were elongated with jaws that worked side to side instead of up and down. There was a lot of them standing on the cliffs, but with nothing to give perspective, it was hard to tell how tall they were. They didn't look worried at all. Jim looked around. The whole crew had seen them and fallen quiet. What kind of monsters were they? And what kind of treasure could they possibly have that would interest the captain? The crew looked at each other in wide-eyed fear. Some began fingering their weapons and looking askance toward the captain. Gingis just paid them no mind. His beady eyes swept the cliffs as if there were no more than expected. He didn't even glance back at the crew as he turned and rushed back toward his cabin. "Hold steady till you reach the harbor, men," he called over his shoulder as he disappeared through the doorway. "But, Captain," was all the first mate managed to get out before the door slammed shut. He looked a little confused and more than a little distressed. "I told you, boys, but you wouldn't have none of it. This is exactly what the captain was planning when we set out on this trip." Murmurs passed among the crew as Jim spoke. "Now, I tell you, you can't trust an elf. They're all evil. I don't know what they want with the power of that horn, but I will guarantee it ain't likely good. As a matter of fact, it will probably be disastrous for the dwarves." "They don't care about no stinking dwarves," one of the men from the back of the crowd that had gathered called out. "Ain't nothing wrong with dealing with elves." "I agree," Jim called back. This seemed to shock them back into silence. They hadn't expected him to agree with them. As long as you keep them in view at all times during the deal. Nothing that's happened with this one has been above board. It was all on the sly. And do any of you see any elves here now? Why is that, do you think? The murmur had started again, and several of the men moved away from each other in obvious disagreement with the way the others was seeing the situation. "I'll tell you why. It's because this is a very dangerous mission, and they didn't want to take the risk. And as for dwarves, who stands between the elves and everyone else if the dwarves fall? Do you think they'll be satisfied after they crush the dwarven kingdom? You think they'll just let us alone? That may be a long time in coming, Nothing we has to worry about. Maybe not, but what of your families then? What of your sons and daughters? Jim saw he was losing them with that tack. A lot of them were only here for themselves and didn't care one whit about the spawn they had left behind in many ports in which they had taken shore leave. And what of your booty on this voyage? What if the captain's booty is a box of something you can't see or touch? Something elves can use? What then? The murmurs became angry rumblings at the mention of that. Several voices rose above the rest, adding to the turmoil. Jim had no desire to be the start of a mutiny, but he knew the elves were evil. He couldn't just let the captain hand over that magic and doom that might doom them all. Drawing his sword in one hand and pulling the single-shot pistol from his belt with the other, he started toward the captain's door. I, for one, do not intend to be had by any elves. A roar of agreement followed the statement, and Jim heard the sound of metal being bared behind him. That be enough of this kind of talk, the first mate tried to say. It was too little too late, as the crowd of angry men erupted into a surging whirlpool of anger and blood. I stayed close to you, Paul, as we made for the captain's cabin. A few of the more loyal men tried to get in our way, but your Paul was a driven man. He fell on them like the wrath of heaven had been fired in his breast. He waded through them like they weren't even there. A few of them might even gotten him, but I had his back. Jimmy never paused as he came to the door. He planted his boot squarely next to the latch, and I swear it sounded like thunder as that old door busted open. Captain Ginjash stood at the chart table in the middle of the room. It was the same desk at which Jim had seen him speaking to the elves. The unfired pistol was still gripped in Jim's hand, and he pointed it at the captain. So it's mutiny, then. Captain Ginjash drew his sword. Just then, the single note of a bellowing horn echoed out across the bay. Fear touched the captain's eyes. He reached for the box, but the crack of a pistol shot echoed in the cabin. The box splintered apart as Jim's bullet smashed into it. The jewels that had adorned the sides tore loose and went skidding off into the room. As the eerie horn call still echoed around them, the wayward lass suddenly lost all forward momentum. Sailors stopped and looked around in terror as the wind died down, and the ocean became deadly still. But the stillness was short-lived. The water began to boil around them, as if it were a soup set over a fire. And suddenly huge trees shot up all around the ship, and sailors pushed and shoved to get themselves away from the edge. Men fell screaming into the ocean. It was then that Jim realized it wasn't trees shooting up all around them. It was tentacles. They wrapped themselves around the middle of the lass, crushing men and equipment. Some of the braver soldiers attacked, hacking at them with cutlasses, barely leaving a scratch in the rubbery flesh. With a mighty groan, the lass was lifted up out of the water. It hung suspended over the bulbous mass of a creature that surfaced underneath it. Sailors stared over the edge in horror at the huge beaked maw that opened to receive them. Men dove screaming over the sides, only to be caught by more smaller creatures that had surfaced alongside the first. That creature held the lass up and shook her, like you'd shake a fruit tree to make the fruit fall. Salt dogs fell into the huge maw to be eaten like fish themselves. If they did miss that thing's mouth, more than likely than not, they got ate by the smaller ones. That was the last I seen of you, Paul. We got separated when the last broke apart. Still have night terrors about that time. I spent 3 days in that old barrel, just a-drifting, with the currents. I was near to dead when the fishing boat found me. I took passage on 2 more ships before I made it home, and I've been here ever since. Malden hadn't spoken at all through the entire story. He stared at his uncle with unblinking eyes. Onagar looked at the floor, having long since emptied the contents of the sherry bottle. He waited silently for his nephew to pass judgment on him. It was a long silence. Onagar jerked as Malden's hand gripped his shoulder. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed as he pulled the startled old pirate into his arms and held him close. Onagar sobbed uncontrollably, not knowing why. Why didn't you tell anybody this? Malden asked around the lump in his throat. I told your Ma. She never forgave me for taking her Jimmy into the going on that trip, and Onager swallowed harshly. I never forgave myself. If I'd believed him when he first told me about them elves, then things might have turned out different like. You couldn't have known, Unc, Malden whispered. And then I crawled down into the bottom of my mug and hid from myself and everybody else. It's okay, Unc. We got by. And now you're going to leave me too. What will I do then, lad? What will I do then? I ain't leaving, Unc. Everything's going to be good. You just wait and see. Malden sat down next to his uncle and patted him on the leg. Onager looked at him through eyes bright with hope and tears. You going to stay? Got to. We're all we got now, and family looks out for each other. You stayed with Pa as long as you could. That was good enough for me. And you forgive me? There ain't nothing to forgive. Thank you, lad, Onager whispered. And I swear I'm going to clean up and help around here from now on. No more drinking for me. Let's just take it one day at a time, Malden said with a laugh. The end. That was Bottom of the Mug by S.P.Dorning on A Tall Ship, A Star, and Plunder, edited by the talented Robert Krogg, a very good friend of mine. He has several books out, by the way. Be sure and check him out. And that's the episode for the day. If you enjoy listening to my stories and seeing my content, consider sponsoring me on my Patreon page, or at the very least, subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can get more of the free content that's coming in the near future. Thank you.